And quite frankly, we're only 6 quarters into it, Ben, from the launch to where we are now. And there has never been a technology, in all seriousness, that's captured the imagination of so many technologists, business people in the world, investments, podcasts, all sorts of things that are just spawning from this. It just makes it so incredible to be part of this space. So that was my moment and that was my story.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today I'm speaking with Stephen Hall, who's Chief AI Officer and President of ISG EMEA. ISG is a global technology research and advisory firm. Steve, thanks so much for joining today.
Hey, Ben, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be a great discussion. Right before the show, we both found out that we are kindred spirits in being Spurs fans. So I'm excited to talk about AI with another Spurs fan. Yes, but before we dig into kind of your perspective on enterprise AI today, can you share maybe a more personal story of when was that first moment you had with AI and how did it influence your career path?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved in computers, leading large organizations and everything really since the late 80s. So, obviously AI has been around for a long time, but I'm not one of those that says this is just another fad or anything. I think to me, November 30th, 2022 changed everything. You know the date as well as I do. That was the date ChatGPT was launched. Why was that so critical, though? I mean, the mark for me was how it completely democratized AI in really the same way for me that the iPhone democratized the smartphone and created a whole new industry. That's what OpenAI and ChatGPT did. So I sit on our board with ISG, and I'm at an event early December, December 7th or December 8th. Now I'm sort of the techie on the board, and people know I'm a geek and I read all the time and all that sort of stuff, right? But I had two young guys come up and say, Steve, have you seen this Chat GPT stuff? And these were two young finance guys. And I said, yeah, but I haven't really, played around with it a lot yet. And for 30 minutes, these guys were both sort of early 30s, so excited about all the capabilities. I wrote a poem, I wrote a song, I ended up doing a performance review for this guy, and I was able to do all this. Their enthusiasm. So I went home, started getting more into it, and it was like, wow, 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 wow. And then on February 17th, I think was the date of 2023, it's on the cover of Barron's magazine. Now, if you know anything about being a CEO or chief of anything, Barron's is what every CEO in America at least reads every Sunday morning. So I'm reading Barron's and I laugh at my wife and I said, you know what? My boss is going to call me on Monday and want me to present to the board what we're doing for AI. 7:30 in the morning, I get my text from Mike. Mike says, Steve, I need you to go to the board and our external board and talk about what this AI thing was. So in this incredibly short period of time, it became this massive thing. And quite frankly, we're only 6 quarters into it, Ben, from the launch to where we are now. And there has never been a technology, in all seriousness, that's captured the imagination of so many technologists, business people in the world, investments, podcasts, all sorts of things that are just spawning from this. It just makes it so incredible to be part of this space. So that was my moment and that was my story.
Yeah, I like that because you also put it in the context of, AI has been around for such a long time, and there have been these massive advances in the field, but that moment felt different. And as you said, it was kind of the first democratized access, the first consumer experience of what this technology can really do. I remember I had a similar moment. I think in December, I was sitting around the dinner table with my family for kind of like Christmas dinner and trying to explain to them what this meant, like look at what this can do and
Yep.
feel why it's different. And they had some reaction to it, but I think not quite as much as the world and everything that happened afterwards. I'm curious, I've heard you talk and write about the Cambrian explosion. Like you've characterized this as the Cambrian explosion. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you see the current state of AI today?
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that because I do really equate it to the Cambrian explosion. And if you go back through geology and everything else, the Cambrian explosion was that period of time where life just really massively evolved. Life had existed. We had, lots of different things, but this explosion of life through the fossil components was massive. If you look at Gen AI in particular, and OpenAI as a community, and Azure and AWS, but that launch of the LLMs in particular, it generated so much excitement and so many startups. So if you started looking at everything that was coming out of the open community, the general community broadly, you literally saw thousands of apps being launched in the matter of months. Some of them were hits, some of them were not hits, but there was just this explosion. Now, the last time we had this was probably the .com piece. We all sort of know what happened there, but it was very different this time because we were building on something and, I guess building on the shoulders of giants that helped us get us to this point. And this Cambrian explosion continues because you saw this, you know, money guy, you saw this big flow of money into all the investments with everything. Now, NVIDIA, Amazon, Microsoft, OpenAI, Meta, Google, they all got their big share of the investments and wins, right? But there was also this massive startup community that everybody was looking for investments. ISG, because we do a lot of outsourcing, benchmarking support, we really understand the service provider community or the large outsourcers really well. So the Infosys, the Winpros, Accenture, TCS, Cognizant, HCL, Atos, Capgemini, that whole space. What we saw there was this massive investment as well. I think within the first month, Accenture came out and said, we're going to invest $3 billion in this technology immediately, right? These are companies that understand tech. Accenture is one of the largest firms in the world, understand tech as well as anybody. They said Gen I is the game changer. Everybody lined up and followed almost immediately. You had hundreds of thousands of people getting trained and understanding what a prompt engineer was when we hadn't even heard the term in October of 22, right? And this explosion just continued. And then you had CIOs, CEOs, board members, people all the way down into development organizations coming up, all within just a couple quarters. And I've never seen an explosion of technology and the adoption that built so much excitement. And quite frankly, that excitement is carrying on. It's not, metaverse, we got excited about, made some sense. There was a little bit of splash. We all got the glasses, looked cool, figured out that there wasn't really a lot there yet, even though I think that's still to come as well. And AI will help that. But you're just seeing this explosion. So it keeps to be so excited for the people that are deeply involved in it.
Yeah, it is. It is a very interesting moment. You mentioned so much investment. We've seen some really interesting, also just like deal structures between major cloud providers and some of the big LLM companies. Obviously, an explosion in startups. I think
Yeah.
in some cases, the vast majority of them being just kind of like GPT wrappers almost and things like that. And so I think it's very hard for companies, large companies, and even the systems integrators, like some of the ones that you mentioned, to get a sense of what's real, what's differentiated, what's valuable. How are companies prioritizing their AI spending? And, you being close to the board members, the execs in some of
Yeah.
these companies, like how are they talking about this and what are they thinking about?
It's interesting because again, the time frame is always important to me. We're 6 quarters in from November 30th, just 6 quarters. And I keep harping on that because people are like, we're not moving fast enough. This is just a fad. We're at the top of the hype scale. It's going down. That's not how the boards think about it. That's not how senior execs in IT organizations and other organizations think. They're measured in their response, but they see so many opportunities. And I would put the opportunities in a couple categories. The first category is probably the revenue generating opportunities. How can I use Gen AI in particular to accelerate my product design, to accelerate or my time to market and time to value and hit products that are more aligned to what consumer needs are. So you're seeing everything from fashion industry to media, everybody kind of driving that time to value, especially in engineering, to help drive products that are really based on it. So, I sent a note to some colleagues today on shoe companies and, designing better shoes based upon Gen AI and taking in all sorts of information on what the best is. And you can imagine some of the shoe companies, maybe in the Oregon area, that are likely doing this, right? And what I said was, we're not going to go in and help an organization design a better shoe with Gen AI. But if you imagine the software engineering process that goes into running a really large organization, then how do you help better requirements definition, faster software development, better, more resilient, secure code, better testing, less defects in production, sort of that whole value stream that impacts the launch of that shoe. And that's what organizations are seeing. And that's where the investments are. We did a study, I think this was in April, for what we call the ISG index, which kind of tracks the whole market. And what was cool about this study, I was a little bit skeptical on what the really dollars were because I heard a lot of pilots and POCs. But in the last 12 months, there was over 6.1 billion of projects for SIs in AI, where they had really launched through. Again, they had only been production wise for a couple quarters. So to generate 6.1 billion that quickly, that's going to be at 30 or 40% this next quarter. I have no doubt that that's accelerating. And I think we'll see, massive growth over the next 5 to 6 years on a scale that we haven't seen since the cloud providers or the hyperscalers really launched at that level.
Yeah, I think it makes sense given your context and kind of who you work with, but I think you drilled into something so important, which is that whole application development lifecycle within these large companies and just the sheer volume of processes that touches within the enterprise. Because I think people frequently talk about generative AI within the context of content generation. And of course, like you can see code as content and you're generating code and it's facilitating that. But I think there's a bigger revolution happening here, like particularly when you start to combine different systems and AI models with generative AI. Given that you're so close to that, and I know that you've put out something about applied AI advisory services. I think is something that ISG offers. Talk through that a little bit. Like, how do you see that process within the enterprise? What do you think there's the most potential for?
I think at the enterprise, whether you think of IT operations or just software development, and let's just take software development because that's when I think everyone in our audience can appreciate. If you start off at the beginning of the software piece, what are the features and functions? What are the priorities? What are the requirements for that, right? Imagine having your features and functions with Gen AI accelerated by getting better insights to how those features and functions are actually going to be revenue generating and do some real A/B testing, if you will, on early features and functions based upon generative AI and digital twins, if you will, of those capabilities. Then accelerate into the requirements, right? How do I create my user stories? How do I create use cases? Have a conversation like we're on right now, recorded, let Copilot go through and create it. Create all of a sudden, your script, your personas, how you want to do your prompt engineering that really says, here's my user stories, here's my use cases, let me give them to my developers. Developers are going to use Gen AI to do the design. So the design is going to be, here's everything that we have now. Here's the requirements that we have. Here's how we sort of think through it. How do I now pull that together so I can really accelerate this through my product design period? Coding is going to take out at least 50 to 60% of the effort that it takes to code. We're already seeing that. But one of the boards that I sit in on is the CISQ, Consortium for Information Software Quality. We're already integrating better code design, better security to make their code more resilient based upon best coding practices. So when you put that through your CI/CD pipeline, now all of a sudden you've got really good code. Well, great coding, guess what that does? That reduces the defects that are in the code. It reduces the amount of testing. Testing is going to use the things that you did at the very beginning. And now you've got a much more driven test period because you've integrated Gen AI into how you do your testing, and that's embedded in. So then you get all the way done. The defects that come into production, the amount of rework, we're seeing 10x difference. It's going to go from probably a 10% defect rate to probably a 1.5% defect rate. I mean, massive, massive changes here. That's going to carry through, and that whole cycle not only accelerates, but you get a better result. So your time to market accelerates for everything. It's pretty exciting when you look at it across the whole spectrum.
That whole cycle is being upended, as you say, or at least improved.
Yeah.
It resonates a lot with the work that we're doing here because we're all about this notion that there is an enormous amount of intellectual capital that exists within companies, right? There is not just knowledge within experts' minds, but there is knowledge across your unstructured data, right? And capturing that knowledge has been very difficult, and generative AI is fantastic for that. We have a strong belief that using formal computational systems, formal logic systems is an incredibly powerful way to then make sure that you have the reliability and accuracy when you're delivering, results from those software applications. But again, using generative AI at the beginning, capturing the knowledge, and then when you're delivering solutions to the end users that are building applications, there's so much interesting stuff going on here. I think one thing that we have seen in the industry a lot is it only going so far within the enterprise in particular, in the sense that like true decision making applications and like operationally complex applications, when you're playing around with LLMs, like that can get complicated because they're just not quite reliable. Like how are you seeing that play out in the enterprise? Are you seeing people move cautiously or building hybrid systems or composite systems? How are they doing it?
It's an interesting question, Ben, for a lot of things, because at the same time that this Cambrian explosion is taking place, we're in a really difficult macroeconomic environment. And so you see a lot of decisions being delayed, especially at the enterprise level, just because of the macro environment. The inflation rates are starting to come down, but interest rates are still, way too high for most enterprises because they're borrowing operating cash at a much higher rate. So their decision making and their ability to buy new software, new functions is hampered right now at the exact same time that we're seeing this explosion. So part of what we're seeing organizations do is say, how can I use Gen AI to get the productivity improvements that I need to reduce my cost base in order to invest that in the things that are going to generate the next value? So that's sort of probably one, this macro environment. Two is there's still a lot of unknowns on AI. For even though we've democratized that people are using it, they don't understand the magic, if you will, or the black box, or how answers are derived, or what does 9 billion neurons and weightings and biases really mean, right? And anytime a client that's going to write a big check doesn't know something, they're going to delay of that fear. Is there something else coming out? Is there a next big thing that I'm going to miss? If I spend money on X, then I can't spend money on Y. So that's delaying some of those decision making. I think the hyperscalers are helping. Quite frankly, I think the whole SaaS community is making a massive difference. And the way that the SaaS community has really embraced Gen AI and embedded in their products is going to make the adoption easier for the enterprises, which will make it easier for other add-on components to come in and do that. So I think that's going to be really helpful. Is that the high tide raises all boats, is, that sort of analogy with it. I think that will be really beneficial as they do it. And then, quite frankly, I think there's going to be so many success stories that there's going to be a lot of push on execs, whether it's chief AI officers like myself or CIOs or CTOs, to adopt and move faster. I'm working with a major, I want to say the client is a major steel company right now that's looking at how do I integrate Gen AI into everything across reducing my carbon emissions, understanding what my carbon emissions is, making smarter steel, making stronger steel, looking at the IT/OT devices, using Gen AI to create your digital threads and your digital twins. So there's so many use cases that are so incredibly powerful that even if you look at some of the large language action models and tying now tasks together like we're seeing, you're going to see a big explosion on this as well to really have full workflow all the way through it.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on something in particular. You mentioned the black box and probably the reluctance of CTOs and chief AI officers to use this type of technology because it doesn't have traceable logic, right? And it's hard to understand. Like startups can obviously move very fast. I think for enterprises, that's a major sticking point. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And also, what are some of the other key challenges you see when companies are trying, as you said, to just deploy AI across every use case within their organization?
Yeah, it's going to be the risk profile for all of them when it comes down to it. Some of it is the black box aspect and the hallucination aspect. And because I don't know how it came up to the answer, I don't know if the answer is reliable. So for anything that's critical, you're absolutely going to have human in the loop, to carry that through. But the other aspect, there's still a lot of legal structure that we've got to get through, whether that's on the regulatory side or the legal side or the ethical side. There's big concerns because we don't understand how the answers are derived or even what data sets were necessarily used to train the LLM and the integrity of the answers coming out. How can you use that in certain processes? Probably the two easy examples are, let's just take talent acquisition. Anybody that looks at it and says, man, why would we have Gen AI go through every CV, match it up with what our expertise is that we want to come out with a perfect match? Well, think how bad that could be if you're just trained on a small subset of engineers that happen to look this, that are this age, that are this ethical background or this economic background. I mean, it could lead to such a disproportional discussion around what we do for those, for engineers, just in that case. And so I think all of us clearly say, you're right, we can't do that, but it seems like such an easy thing to do. But how do you train data sets to really do that? And how do you get it to look deeper in that, those may not be the qualities that make a great engineer or make a great product manager or this. And there's actually other qualities that do that are more inherent that you don't necessarily capture on the empathy side, et cetera. The other one is certainly anything around claim processing or anything on the financial side, credit scoring, where you're making decisions that are so defined that, again, make it clear, but there's a whole lot of parameters that go into that. So I think the understanding of those data sets, healthcare is obviously the other one that's so clear. I think until we get a little bit of regulatory guidance or at least legal coverage, organizations are going to always keep a human in the loop on some of those decisions before they really scale. So I think for the next couple of years, you're going to continue to see, quite a bit of human in the loop, even though you probably don't need that human in the loop aspect. We'll want those safeguards as we go forward. The
Yeah,
EU
I
AI
agree.
Act, California, I mean, others are really kind of taking the lead on how we think through this.
Yeah, and even in New York, I think there was a directive about not being able to use AI in recruiting or kind of talent
Yeah. Yeah.
acquisition. But you pointed out a good thing about whether is it a feature or a bug in terms of LLMs, right? Because they are
Yeah.
statistical systems that are inevitably biased by their training data. And
Yep.
so I think that's going to be a challenge that is going to see the growth of a lot of more hybrid architectures, right? In order to deal with that, how do you use them for what they're fantastic at? And then use other systems to bring that reliability and that accuracy. One thing that you've spent a lot of time on is also thinking about ROI, right? As you make these deployments,
Yeah.
how businesses are measuring success of these AI integration efforts and these early use cases. How are businesses thinking about that?
For those on the productivity side, it's really about cost savings. And those cost savings are primarily going to be in a couple areas around the reduction of labor. Now, I am a massive optimist, as you can probably already pick up as we talk through. So I don't think we're talking about the class of jobs or the replacement of jobs or anything like that. I think there's going to be new job creation. There's going to be other jobs that it's going to be more accurate, better for AI to do those things. It's going to be fairly straightforward for organizations to look and say, hey, this is what it takes for me to run my IT operations today. If I use Gen AI or I automate this, this is what it's going to cost me tomorrow. and my ROI on that is pretty clear. Same with, applications. There's going to be other things, and I think this is a great case for customer experience and CX, where you're going to say, my ability to upsell or cross sell or deal with an unhappy customer and make them happier because I've got these insights, because I'm pulling data from all my systems. I've now got a common architecture that I can have multiple LLMs to help really solve it. You're going to see an uptick in revenue for it. So most of the enterprises we talk to are going to be really clear. Engineering is all going to be time to value, and probably time to value, resiliency, security would be probably the top three things right now that they think of that the ROI would be associated with. But I think that's going to change rapidly as well. I think we're going to continue to see that. We've got a client that we've been working with for some time that was really concerned about tokenization and bandwidth and what the architecture was going to do. Well, if you look at the launch of 4 ohm, the tokenization costs are drastically less, and how the tokens are passed back and forth is drastically less between 3, 5, and 4. So I think you're going to continue to see these improvements. Whether we call that Moore's law, we come up with something else for AI, exponential growth. That some of these models that we're creating right now, we're going to laugh at a year from now. So why did we even spend time on thinking through those?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one because that's a lot of people bring that up, right? This is the worst version of these models that we will ever use,
Yeah,
kind of that argument. But then I think there's the other side too of, again, these models inherently have limits by design. And so it's going to be interesting how organizations integrate them with other systems. Do you have any best practices for successful AI adoption that you would want to share for companies that are trying to do this right now?
you know, I think the best practice right now is to remain curious and to remain engaged. It's really easy right now for organizations to put up boundaries and guardrails and not do anything or do very limited things. And quite frankly, I think that's the worst thing that you can do. The technology is so powerful in so many ways that everybody, regardless of what job, what role you're doing, is going to benefit from it. Organizations need some guardrails. They need to be able to say, here's the types of things you can and can't do, and here's the human in the loop, and here's the validation that we want. But I do get concerned. And in Europe, I say a lot, innovate versus regulate. And you've got to be able to right now in safe, defined areas. And I think enterprises really need to be able to allow some of that to take place in controlled spaces to do it. That would be the first one, and continue that. And that's probably be my advice for probably the next several quarters, maybe the next year as we're still accelerating. The other thing is there are a lot of proven use cases already that have been demonstrated that you can get on board with right away. This isn't necessarily a technology where you have to go through, a pilot and, a POC and then a pilot and then do this and then have board after board decide. There's a lot of use cases across the community on how quickly they come up that are adaptable. And that's the great thing about Gen AI. It's easy to replicate, right? Because you're already seeing, as we talked about early on with the startup community. So get started, look at some of the best practices that are out there and drive it forward.
Yeah, and as organizations do that, I think chief AI officers like yourself you're gonna see more of them, and they're gonna play more and more of a pivotal role in the deployment of
Yeah.
technology. Can you discuss that role a little bit and how you think it might evolve?
Yeah, I think right now for me and for a lot of my colleagues, there's probably multiple roles with it. One is getting a better appreciation of the risks that are inherent in it, how to manage those risks and how to take advantage of it. And this is probably core to what you do as well, Ben, is the data aspect. You really have to get a better understanding of your data and pull that together. I don't buy the garbage in, garbage out rule with LLMs. It's a completely different paradigm. So I think people that do that, it's not the same paradigm. But having strong data within an organization to pull it that you can properly train the LLM or at least use with APIs that are aligned is really critical as we go forward. And I think what we've learned in our own experiences over the last year is how your data strategy has to change to really appreciate the value that you can get. And there's so much data internally, but the other thing I think we've learned is what we think is proprietary, what we think is the only thing we have. As soon as you ask ChatGPT or Anthropic or any of the engines, it's amazing how they know about things that we think are so proprietary that we do that somebody else probably did. So it may not be as proprietary as what we believe sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, or someone talked to ChatGPT before you and they fed that data into the model. You never know.
Yeah, exactly. And then it learned, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah. And for individuals, I guess we focused a lot on businesses. For people that aspire to this kind of role, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I was asked this on a panel before. My answer then and my answer still is be a constant learner, be incredibly curious, always ask why, challenge yourself and stay on top of it. I think there's some core skills that you need to do to be successful with this. You have to understand data. You have to have a fairly good understanding of the principles behind it. But you really have to be curious, and you really have to help drive forward the things and recognize things that we knew yesterday are likely to change tomorrow, and be okay with that because that's how fast things are moving. Have a good risk profile, manage that as you go forward, but just stay curious, as you go forward and work with your organizations to help balance that risk and the drive that you can do.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for anyone in any role, but it applies even more so for someone that's working in this field with just the pace of
Exactly.
innovation that we're seeing. And on that note, before we wrap up, always like to end kind of forward looking. How do you see the future of enterprise AI applications? How is it going to evolve over the next few years?
That's the name of my podcast, Ben. Imagine your future. So it's a good segue into how do we really see it. I think, in all seriousness, without the hyperbole, Gen AI and the LLMs are the most disruptive technology that we've seen. It's going to be more disruptive than the cell phone, than the iPhone, than the cloud, than any technology that we've seen. I already saw multiple announcements this week where we have LLMs as operating systems, thinking through the complete integration. Being able to put this amount of knowledge at your fingertips that's actionable, that makes everybody better across every job role that's out there is absolutely phenomenal. So there's going to be so much adoption and change as we go through the next 3 years. I mean, I think by 2030, the numbers are off the chart, whether it's ISG or McKinsey or BCG, we're all making, big guesses of what the size of the market is going to be, but it's going to be absolutely transformative. My mom, 81 years old, watching the news, knows I've got this fancy title, calls me up and wants to know how to get on Chat GPT or how to use AI. You know, Other people call up, well, should I be concerned about the ethical use of AI? I'm like, what are you talking about? It's everywhere. Again, we democratized it. It's got this great thing. So I think you're going to continue to see that explosion and continue to see it used across enterprises in so many unique ways.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time. And speaking to that democratization and the societal impact, I think these things were happening, but they were not part of public discourse, right? And right now it's
Exactly.
very much the center of public discourse. So it's going to be very interesting how the space evolves and how businesses adopt it. Stephen, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. That's all we have time for today. And if people want to follow your work, learn more, listen to your podcast, read more of your work, where should they go?
Yeah. First of all, you can find me on LinkedIn, Stephen Hall. You can connect with me at ISG, www.isg-1one.com. Or you can listen to the Imagine Your Future podcast, which is on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast that you listen to.
Well, you heard him. That was Stephen Hall from ISG. Stephen, thank you so much for joining today.
Ben, thank you. Pleasure.